Hello again, everyone. I am asked pretty regularly for suggestions for good books or good resources to learn more about fairies. So I thought I would do a quick video with my personal suggestions for options people might consider, with the understanding that my primary focus is Ireland and to a lesser degree Scotland. So most of what we're going to have here is going to be focused on those cultures. I really don't know as much about Cornish, Manx, or Welsh fairies. There is a book coming out fairly soon by Mara Starling on Welsh fairies, which I do highly recommend. It is not published yet, so I don't have a copy of that here to show people, but I would suggest that if you're interested in Welsh fairies. We'll also say before I get into this, I have a lot of books to recommend. Most of them are on the more academic end of things. I know that's not ideal for everyone, but these are the sources that I tend to suggest to people. I find that a lot of the more mass market books that are out there tend to have a variety of issues, from not being particularly accurate to the folklore, leading more into fiction, containing questionable material, just a lot of issues. So these are the ones that I know are pretty trustworthy and that I use myself and recommend to other people. So the first one is A Dictionary of Fairies by Katherine Briggs. Katherine Briggs is considered sort of the go-to for anything relating to fairy folklore. She has a variety of books. This happens to be the one that I myself use the most often. Really anything by her, though, is a good option. The only issue, which I am going to mention here with Briggs, is that the majority of her work was done between the 1950s and the later 1970s. So at this point, it is a bit dated. Briggs was also not always particularly discerning with her source material, so she does rely on some sources that we now know, some 70 to 50 years after these books were written, are not really the best options to look at. William Butler Yeats being one of those. So not everything in Briggs' work is going to be 100% accurate to the actual folklore, but it is nonetheless still one of the best options out there, and I do still recommend it. Just keep that in mind. The next one that I want to suggest to people is an anthology. This means this includes a variety of articles by different authors. It's called Airy Nothings, Imagining the Otherworld of Fairy from the Middle Ages to the Age of Reason. It covers a range of different material. It's focused on particular folklore or particular folkloric beings, but I have found it really useful. I find it really reliable, and I think it touches on specific aspects of things that maybe not other sources are necessarily going to touch on, but that are important to consider. And I like that it covers an age range for the material. The next one, kind of in that same vein, this is another anthology, again including multiple articles by different authors. It's called Knowing Demons, Knowing Spirits in the Early Modern Period. This is not necessarily fairy specific, but it does include chapters that cover fairies and touch on a range of fairy beliefs. And one of the things that tends to get very complicated for understanding fairy folklore, particularly older fairy folklore, is the way that it intersects and interweaves with beliefs around demons, around other types of spirits, ghosts even. There are not the sort of hard and fast lines that we might want or expect today. So I find this book very useful in sort of establishing that and helping to make it more clear, as much as we can on the subject, how these things may have been understood historically and how blurry those lines and those definitions can be. Sort of the modern concepts that we have today are actually often very different from how these beings were understood in older folk material. So this would be one of the more important ones, I think, that I'm recommending in this video. And I would like to say, despite the fact that this is now the third Palgrave Historical Studies book that I've recommended in a row, this video is not being sponsored by Palgrave Publishing. I just happen to be a fan of their publishing house and their work. Although if they want to sponsor me, they are perfectly free to start sending me books. That would be amazing. So again, another anthology, Fairies, Demons, and Nature Spirits, Small Gods at the Margins of Christendom. This is one of the main ones I recommend here because it is really looking at the odd sort of niche that fairies fit into in belief. And it discusses, again, this overlap, this blurry line between fairies, demons, nature spirits, gods. Here refers to them as small gods, but the way that these concepts sort of flow together and can be very hard to clearly separate. The articles, the various chapters in the book touch on a range of really important subjects if you want to do a deep dive into understanding how these beings were understood. Again, particularly during and especially prior to the Victorian era. I realize not everyone is interested in that who necessarily follows this channel, but I do think it's a good basis. And if those things interest you, this is definitely an especially important one to consider getting and reading. I will say, in fairness, the Palgrave books, because they are an academic publisher, they are not inexpensive. Palgrave used to run a sale once a year where they would significantly discount, especially their hardbacks, which you'll note is what these are. And so I would basically wait until the sale and then hit them up for all the books that I wanted to get that I could then afford. I do not believe they have done that since COVID, but they do, I believe, now do an ebook sale. I personally am not a fan of ebook for a variety of reasons, but if you are, it's worth keeping in mind that they tend to run a sale right around the end of the year, the beginning of the new year, where they significantly discount at least some of their materials. So if you are interested in these books and find them to be too pricey, which is completely fair, consider keeping an eye out for that sale. Might be a better time to try to get these at a slightly more affordable rate. So next, we're moving away from the anthologies, at least for a moment. Elf Queens and Holy Friars, Fairy Beliefs in the Medieval Church. This is by Richard Firth Green. I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Green at Ohio State University at a conference in 2019 and to listen to him give a presentation there. Very brilliant, very knowledgeable about fairy beliefs in England, particularly during this period. This book, I think, is really essential for anyone who wants to understand the specifically English beliefs around fairies. And I kind of emphasize this one because when we think of fairies in England today, because it was really the Victorian era in England and to a lesser degree the United States that reshaped and rewrote fairies into the twee beings that we have today, that were then, of course, co-opted and incorporated into the New Age movement to kind of give us the Tinkerbell-esque beings that we have now. I think it's really essential to sort of understand that that is not how these beings have always been understood in England, and that in fact there is a significant and quite deep prior history there of folk beliefs of a very different nature. And there's a lot of fascinating material in here that I think would interest a range of people, but obviously particularly me, because this is one of my favorite books. I recommend it a lot in various places, and I rely on it a lot in my own writing. So definitely have to give a shout out to that one. The next one, I'm trying to move through these fairly quickly because I do have, I think it's 17 total books to get through, so try to bear with me. We are back to the anthologies again, the Supernatural in Early Modern Scotland. This, again, is a series, a collection of different articles, different chapters written by different people. However, it offers quite an interesting range of views on fairy belief and the supernatural more generally in early modern Scotland, which would be Scotland from roughly the 16th, 17th century forward, including the witchcraft trial period, which is a period of particular interest to me. And it really kind of lays out the range of those beliefs and how those beliefs impacted different areas of society, how they impacted different historical events, even including those witchcraft trials. And again, if you're interested in fairies, the entire book is not about that, but there is enough material in here that I think it is worth people taking a look at. The next book I want to touch on is Scottish Fairy Belief by Liz Ann Henderson and Edward Cowan. This, of course, is entirely focused on fairy belief in Scotland. This is another really essential book. I rely on it quite a bit, and I have used it extensively in my own writing and my own research. It gets very in-depth into Scottish fairy belief in various places across Scotland, across a range of time. And honestly, if you're interested in Scottish fairy belief in particular, this is sort of the essential go-to book, in my opinion. Surprisingly or not, fairy belief in Scotland can be extremely difficult to research. There is not a great deal that has been written about it. There are not many books out there focused exclusively on this topic. Even within academia, it does not seem to be something that is written as extensively about as perhaps some other aspects of fairy belief and fairy belief within other cultures can be. So I do strongly recommend this one if the subject interests you. It is a more academic work, but the writing I found to be reasonably accessible. It is not as difficult to get into or follow as some of the other books potentially can sometimes be. And it is really well indexed, which is always a nice feature for any of these kind of books. The next one I want to recommend, this is one of the oldest ones. I think it actually is the oldest one I'm recommending. I generally try to avoid recommending the older books because anytime you're reading a book, really pre 1970s even, and again, this would include some of Briggs' work, but particularly material that is getting into like pre 1940s and 1930s, there are specific aspects of that work that really have to be taken into consideration. You have to sort of understand how to read it with the understanding of the biases of those authors, the perspectives that they had, the way that folklore was treated at those time periods, which is significantly different from the way it's treated today, and with an understanding that everything is going to have to be cross-checked extensively because the authors often would either fabricate things or highly embellish the material they were recording. This is one of the reasons that Yeats is particularly problematic. So I don't often recommend the older books, and I will usually suggest people either avoid them initially or just be very cautious with them. But this particular book by Lowry Charles Wimberley, Folklore in the English and Scottish Ballads, I have found to be quite significantly important. And also, it is sort of one of a kind. I am not aware of anything that has been written more recently than this. And this was originally published in 1928, republished in 65, which this is a 65 edition. But I'm not aware of anything that has been written really in the last 100 years since then that touches on this same topic and covers it as thoroughly and really digs into this as well. And I do find that The English and Scottish ballad material is really essential for understanding fairy folk belief uh, through a variety of lenses. Not only because the ballad material is still current today, is still being sung and adapted and modified and even used in fiction, but also because it represents sort of a continuous thread of belief that maintains some of the older ideas and concepts that have otherwise largely been lost in popular culture. So I think understanding the ballad is very important. That's one of the reasons on this channel that I did a short series on the ballads and discussed a variety of them that touched specifically on fairies. There's a lot in this book that is really worth digging into. Again, it is the oldest book I'm talking about here, but I do think it is one that is particularly useful. I will say, because it is older, the language is a bit antiquated. And if you aren't used to reading material that is, 100 years old or so, it might be a little off-putting. I know not everyone is super thrilled with reading older material for that reason. Nonetheless, though, I do recommend it. I do think it's a good resource for people. From here, we're going to move into some of the more culture-specific outside of Scotland. And my particular culture of interest, which would be Ireland. This book is The Banshee, The Irish Death Messenger by Patricia Lysat. Patricia Lysat in general is a good resource. She does have other material out there, not as abundantly, perhaps as some other authors, but I would trust her as a source when you run across her. This was originally her dissertation, so it is extremely thorough on the subject. As you can see, it is not a small book, and it is very heavily academic. It is also, due to the nature of the book, including quite a range of Irish language material. So if you're not comfortable with Irish language material, if you don't have any Irish and you're not someone who is comfortable running across a lot of that sort of thing, just be aware that that is something you will be finding in this book. Be prepared for it. I actually really appreciate that there's so much Irish language material in here, that she does use the terms in the language of the culture as opposed to anglicizing everything, because often anglicization can be a problem. Things get lost in translation in a very literal sort of way. So this is, as the title suggests, focused very specifically on the Banshee and folklore relating to that. It is enormously in-depth onto that subject and the history of it and the variety of explanations for those folk beliefs. But even outside of that, if you're interested in Irish fairy beliefs more generally, there is an abundance of material in here that is definitely worth getting into. This is another book that I often recommend and have a high regard for. I suggest it to a range of people, whether you're interested in Irish fairy lore more specifically, fairy belief more generally, Irish paganism, Irish witchcraft, the old Irish mythology, any of that, all of that's going to get kind of touched on in here in various ways, and it's just a really solid resource. Now, I do have a small selection, I believe it's 4 books, of more modern collections of Irish fairy folklore by authors in Ireland. I do always suggest, with the culturally specific fairy beliefs, that you look for authors within that culture who are writing from their own experience and who have direct access to the folk beliefs as much as possible. So this is The Fairy Faith in Ireland by Laura O'Brien. This one is intended to have a more pagan focus for modern practitioners of paganism. It is written in a very accessible way, and it covers a range of beliefs relating to the fairy faith, to folk beliefs and folk practices relating to the good folk in Ireland. today and to some degree historically. And then we have Finding Fairy Mysteries in Donegal, Close Encounters with Wee Folk by Keith Corcoran. This, again, is another fairly recent book. I should also say, as I'm getting into some of these, while O'Brien's book is available on Amazon and other major booksellers, some of these other ones are actually a little more difficult to find. You will have to either contact the seller, or some of them are available in smaller shops in Ireland. They obviously can be gotten. I have gotten copies of them, but they're not necessarily as easy to find as some of the other ones. It is worth making that effort, though, if the subject of Irish fairy belief interests you. This one, of course, is specific to a particular area. That is something you find with a lot of these. O'Brien's book is a more general look at Irish fairy beliefs across the island, but many of them are focused on more specific areas. This one, obviously, is Donegal. The next one is focused more on Galway. It's called Away with the Fairies by William Henry. It contains, both of those contain a range of folk beliefs, folk stories, quite a bit of local material, which is tied to specific places in those areas. So just really a treasure trove of material, particularly because they're books that have come out within the last several years. So very, very on point with the beliefs as they exist today. The historic material is very important. It's a thing I emphasize a lot, but connecting to the modern beliefs is also very important. You want to have that balance. These are books that are more modern. They also are books that are generally more accessible and easier to access and get into. The language they're written in is more relatable, we'll say, than a lot of the academic material tends to be. So, on that note, Irish Fairies, Fearsome or Friendly. This is by Gabrielle Nanwiher. This one is a bit of a more general overview of Irish fairies, as O'Brien's book was, but definitely worth getting. It provides some interesting viewpoints, interesting folk beliefs, and I should also have started this section by saying that it can be very difficult to find books on Irish folk belief, as odd as that might sound, given how popular they are. The majority of what's out there and the majority of what people talk about and recommend is extremely dated and generally well over 100 years old, sometimes pushing 200 years old. So finding modern sources and modern material, particularly in writing, can be quite challenging. That has been changing in the last few years. Almost all of these books that I'm talking about now and recommending have come out within the last 10 years or so. The bulk of them really in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's really nice to see that is changing. If you're interested in Irish fairy and folk belief, there is a YouTube channel called, actually I'm not going to remember what it's called, but it's by Michael Fortune. Michael Fortune is a gentleman in Ireland who has dedicated quite a bit of time to going around and doing interviews with a range of people about various beliefs and folklore, not fairy specific, although he does include quite a bit of fairy material. So it is being preserved in that form, in that medium, but in writing, it can still be a bit challenging to find books that have more of this focus. So the final one, focused on the Irish, we have is Tales of the Wicklow Hills, 2,000 Years of History, Myth, Legend, and Local Stories. This is by Richard Marsh. As you can see, the foreword is by Dahi O'Hogan. Dahi O'Hogan is one of my particularly favorite authors on the subjects of Irish mythology, Irish material more broadly. This one, as with some of the others, is specifically focused. This is on Wicklow. So it does cover more than just fairy beliefs, but it does touch on that. And it, again, is anchoring the stories in very specific places, which is something that we find quite common in Irish folklore, fairy belief, mythology, all of that tends to be very localized and very location specific. So, all of these last few books that I've mentioned, these four are, sorry, five, these five, I definitely highly recommend if the subject of Irish fairy lore and folk belief is of particular interest to you. You will not necessarily find that these all agree with each other or that they're all telling the same versions of the same stories. Folk belief is just not cohesive in that way, and particularly regional variations of folk belief is almost never cohesive in that way. But it offers you a broader understanding of these things. So, highly recommended. And I know this video is getting a little bit long. I promise we are wrapping it up or getting close to wrapping it up. 3 more books I want to recommend. This book is British Fairies by John Cruise. John Cruise tends to focus primarily on English and to a lesser degree sometimes Scottish, Welsh, and a bit of Cornish folk belief. He does have a variety of books beyond just this one. I just picked this one as an example. He has a book through Llewellyn Publishing called Fairy, and then another one called Beyond Fairy. And then he has self-published a selection of smaller books. I don't want to call them quite booklets, but significantly shorter books that are focused on very particular topics within this subject. And he does have a blog online as well. He is a very solid author. He does a great deal of research. I have found him to be pretty trustworthy. And on the topic of English fairies, I would definitely consider him to be one of the main sources people could be looking at for books. Beyond that, I want to recommend Simon Young. Simon Young is probably very close to being the modern equivalent of Katherine Briggs. He has written quite extensively about fairy folk belief across a range of topics. This particular book is on the boggart, which is a particular type of being. I'm not entirely sure that Young himself would classify this as a fairy, but in fairness, this is a very controversial topic. But it's particular type of folk spirit in a specific area of England, and he really digs into the beliefs around it, the practices around it, where it's located, kind of everything you could possibly want to know. He does not have a ton of books out at this point, although he has contributed to other books, anthologies. He does have this one. And he does have a book out on Anne Jeffreys, which touches on some Cornish folk belief, because that was an incident that happened in Cornwall. And I believe he has some other material that he's working on. He has quite a bit on Academia EDU. Again, articles, generally, material that's shorter form. He has a forthcoming anthology that he is putting together on the Cottingley Fairy hoax. So anything by Simon Young, I would say, is pretty solid and trustworthy as a source, especially on English fairy belief, although he does touch on material outside of that as well. And the final book I want to recommend for my trustworthy fairy sources that I suggest people consider getting is Strange Terrain, The Fairy World of Newfoundland by Barbara Wrighty. Barbara Wrighty, I was also lucky enough to hear, I believe I've attended now 2 lectures given by her. One is part of a wider online event, and the second one I believe was to the Folklore Society. I can't entirely remember now, but very knowledgeable. She focuses specifically on fairy belief in Newfoundland, Canada, which is extremely interesting. It's beliefs that were brought over by the diasporic communities, particularly Scottish, but Irish and to a degree French as well, and have really rooted quite strongly in Newfoundland. And it's worth digging into, if you want to learn more about the wider subject of fairy folklore and fairy belief, because people can sometimes get very tunnel vision about where these beliefs are, where they come from, what cultures they're associated with. Geographical blinders, I suppose we could say, tend to get put on. Then reading Wrighty's work, particularly Strange Terrain, it can be very eye-opening to see how these beliefs can move and can be attached to populations as much as they're attached to specific particular places. So, I know this was a lot, and I know this is a long video, but kind of digging into, 17 books, not a short list, that I recommend for people who are interested in the subject of fairies, fairy folk belief, all of that. I have written books myself, but I am not going to recommend my own books here because that just feels silly. But these are the books that I tend to rely on and look to as sources. Of course, books are not your only option. There are many other options you have for digging into this material, but for people who are looking specifically for books, this is what I suggest. These are solid options. As I said at the beginning, unfortunately, a lot of what's out there, particularly outside of the academic material, tends to not be the most reliable or trustworthy material. So you do need to be a little cautious of the more mass market types of things. For example, there's a fairy encyclopedia by, I believe it's Teresa Bain, that is just utterly random. There's so much in there that is coming from like modern role-playing game manuals or modern sources that then can't be verified, and you really can't trust it. And even though people tend to just assume that it's trustworthy, so you just need to be very cautious. These are all books that I know are solid, that I know the material is solid. Unfortunately, as I said, most of them are on the more academic end, which cannot always be the easiest to get into, can be a little more challenging, but they are at least reliable sources. Also, for people who watch my videos and have wondered, where I'm getting the things that I'm saying, where I get the material I repeat, um, kind of what sources I'm drawing on, this is kind of a small sample. These are the ones that I tend to look to the most or find the most reliable. This is sort of where I'm coming from. So I hope this video was helpful. I hope it maybe inspired some people, increased your book list a little bit, or at least gave some people ideas for some reliable options and where I am getting some of the stuff that I say in my videos. And I will see you next time in the next video, which will not be about books, but will probably be about me talking some fairy folklore.